And now we come to the most recent of the Left Behind movies, and this one may be the worst. Left Behind, Rise of the Antichrist. Now, Left Behind, Rise of the Antichrist came out last year, 2023, and I had no idea that this movie existed. The last I heard about the Left Behind franchise was back in 2014 with the dumpster fire of the Nicolas Cage movie. But to my surprise, a couple months ago, I was perusing the DVDs of my local library and I came across this movie, and my wife actually suggested that we check it out and watch it. It might be interesting. It might be a so bad it's good movie. And we popped it in, we found out that while there is some enjoyment to be had, it's not really so bad it's good. It's just kind of generally bad. But let's start at the beginning. So Left Behind, Rise of the Antichrist is kind of a pseudo-sequel to the Nicolas Cage Left Behind movie. Even though Nicolas Cage is not in this movie, it seems to have a completely different cast and crew, except for where the timeline picks up. Because this movie does not start off like the original Left Behind or the Nicolas Cage Left Behind, where you just see all these characters, they're all introduced, and then the rapture happens and they all have to deal with it. But no, here the rapture already happened. The events of the Nicolas Cage movie have already happened, and it picks up pretty much right where the Nicolas Cage movie left off. So I can only assume that going into this movie, you should have already seen the Nicolas Cage movie, which honestly I would not ask of anybody. But having seen it and already being familiar with the Left Behind story, I can put the pieces together. But within the first few scenes, there is a big positive that I have to give this movie, is that it actively tries to rectify the biggest flaw of the Nicolas Cage movie, and it's that the Nicolas Cage movie isn't really a Left Behind movie in the same way that the original Left Behind movie was an adaptation of that first book. Because like I said in my remake video comparing the original with the Nicolas Cage version, the Nicolas Cage version really limits the world building and the outside influences going on that we see in the original, with people like Nicolae Carpathia, the UN, and all the big geopolitical events that set the stage for the rapture that are foretold in the Bible. The Nicolas Cage movie had none of that. It was only about these three main characters and Nicolas Cage's attempt to land a plane where about half of the passengers are gone. So to rectify that, this movie really takes a lot of effort in world building. And some of the world building I think is kind of interesting, looking at it from a biblical perspective, looking at it through the lens of prophecy and plausibility, because I found that really is the best way to view these Left Behind movies. Is it plausible, given what we know in the book of Revelation, that this is how things would unfold, given human nature, given some of the very specific details in the prophecy, and also just seeing where the world is headed geopolitically? Is it plausible that these nations would make alliances and so on and so on? And while I do still have an appreciation for the original book and movie, it is so clearly set in the late 90s, early 2000s, and now that we're in 2023, 2024, the world has changed. So I would expect this movie to change some things, to update some things, and it does do that. There is a bigger presence of social media here, of online streaming, and also just the role and public perception of news networks now is different than they were 20 years ago, and we see that here. And these are all great ideas and do help to make this feel like an updated, fresher take on the Left Behind lore. My issue is in the execution, because I feel like the Left Behind movies always have to walk this delicate line of being relevant to the times so that it feels urgent, that you could see the Antichrist coming to power within our lifetime, but also futuristic enough where we can tell that it isn't exactly right now, that certain things have to advance in technology and just culture in general to get us to that point that is predicted in Revelation. Because personally, as a Christian and as someone who does believe in the rapture, and also that we are in something resembling the last days, I don't believe that we're actually in the last days. I don't think the rapture is coming tomorrow. I think if you critically read the Bible, you can see that there's clearly things that haven't happened yet that need to fall into place. And I think the filmmakers knew that, and in the case of the original Left Behind, I think they balanced that a bit better, where it does still feel a bit futuristic-y, if that even is a word. But here it seems like they leaned more into the, oh, make it relatable, make it current, use certain buzzwords like pandemic that trigger certain associations. And I think the COVID allegory is probably the weakest thing in this movie. It's the thing that, to me, really took me out of the movie, because whatever you may believe about the pandemic and the virus, that whole thing I'm pretty sure is not analogous to something like the rapture. However, that being said, there was something that we did see during COVID times, and that was a great consolidation of power and influence and a very clear disregard for individual liberties. And whether you think that was justified or not, that definitely happened, and if not kept in check, could have led to even more consolidated power, a dictatorship, a one world government. And if the movie focused more on that angle, the consolidation of power, the fear, the panic, and having one ruler step up to lead the people out of that, even though that person is clearly the Antichrist, I could see this movie working a lot better. And even though it is titled Rise of the Antichrist, it feels like that is the B plot to the A plot, which is Rayford Steele, played by Kevin Sorbo, and his daughter Chloe. And if you're at all familiar with the Left Behind movies, you know that around this time, Ray realizes the truth of the situation and that his wife and son were right, and he becomes a Christian. He believes, he puts his faith in God. And in the original movie, this was an incredibly powerful moment. And while it's acted well and Kevin Sorbo does a fine job, I don't think it's as compelling or convicting as it was in the original. It just feels like, well, yeah, okay, of course he has this reaction. And the same thing can be said about Buck Williams, because Buck Williams' conversion in the original is probably one of my favorite scenes. He just has this breakdown in the bathroom because he just realized everything that he thought he knew was a lie, and his whole mindset changed, and it's this incredibly powerful scene, and Kirk Cameron did a great job in acting that out. And here, Buck Williams is played by Greg Perro, and while his acting is fine and he does the right things, the breakdown in the bathroom doesn't hit as hard because of the things that led up to it. Because in the original, he was trying to put all these pieces together. He was doing his whole investigative journalist thing, and you're there along the way putting the pieces together with him, and he's slowly kind of against his better judgment, or what he thinks this is better judgment. But here, you get that a little bit, and there is a lot of investigation. But a lot of that isn't really directly about prophecy or prophecy being fulfilled. It's more about information on this guy, Jonathan Stonegal, played by Neil McDonough, who I legitimately thought was going to be the Antichrist in this movie, but I'll talk more about him later. Buck spends a lot of time investigating this guy, and there's not a lot of direct overlap between that guy and the Antichrist and the Antichrist things happening in the world. What triggers his big emotional breakdown is when this one Jewish rabbi talks about plans to rebuild the temple, and that triggers a memory that he had with the prophecy whiteboard that was in the church earlier, and that realization triggers the breakdown. And I just don't think that's as effective, because it's been my experience that when people come to faith and they finally accept the truth of the Bible, it's not just one thing or one connection that triggers that emotional response. It's usually a pretty slow and incremental journey of coming to faith. You know, recognizing truths in the Bible that appear in real life and vice versa. And while the timing of that is different for everybody, it's usually not, oh, I saw this one thing, now I know it's all true. That usually doesn't happen. And while that may happen sometimes on camera, it just kind of comes across as forced and, oh, we need him to convert right now, right here, before he has his big meeting. I'm really trying to think of positives to say about this movie, because there are some cool ideas. It's just with every idea there comes execution. And probably the biggest missed opportunity in this movie is the casting of Neil McDonough as not the Antichrist, but Jonathan Stonegal, and ends up being killed by the Antichrist, Nikolai Carpathia, who in the original was clearly, obviously the bad guy from the first time you see him. He's got this thick Russian-ish accent, and he just looks and acts schemy like a bad guy, and you know something's up with him. So it doesn't really come as much of a surprise when he shoots the other slimy dirtbag guy, Stonegal, and takes control as the Antichrist. And here I see what they're trying to do with Neil McDonough, because he is very good at playing bad guys. In fact, if you saw The Shift, which also just came out, he plays a version of Satan in that, and he is very good at it. It's probably one of his best performances that I've seen. So going in, you're thinking like, oh, he has to be the Antichrist. He's arguably the most famous person in this film aside from Kevin Sorbo. So when they do pull that switcheroo that he isn't the Antichrist and Nikolai Carpathia is the Antichrist, it should come as kind of a surprise that this other guy, Nikolai Carpathia, who we see in the movie, who I think kind of looks like Kingslayer from Game of Thrones mixed with the personality of Harvey Dent from The Dark Knight, just this really likable, handsome, charming guy that can do no wrong. And through the eyes of Buck Williams, you do start to see this guy as possibly an ally, that maybe he does have the best of the world at heart, that he couldn't be the Antichrist, only for the reveal to be even that more impactful and surprising when he does shoot Stonegal and take control and manipulate everybody else with his Antichrist powers. I could see it almost working if his name was not Nikolai Carpathia, and this wasn't a direct adaptation of the Left Behind story. Because Left Behind as a franchise has been around for over 20 years. I think the book was published in the 90s. And this franchise does have a fan base. There's a lot of Christians that grew up with these books that have fond nostalgia for the movies and for the ideas in it. And when they hear the name Nikolai Carpathia, they're gonna know, oh, that's the Antichrist, watch out for him. So the switcheroo doesn't really work because they already name dropped Nikolai earlier in the movie. I guess there is a way to make it work if you don't reveal his name until later, but at the same time, it's really difficult to go that long and try to make him a likable character without anybody ever saying his name. So because of all that, probably the simplest approach that they should have gone with is just to cast Neil McDonough as the Antichrist, Nikolai Carpathia, and have him act perfectly normal and friendly and charming and charismatic, which Neil McDonough is more than capable of doing. Just look at his performance as Dum Dum Dugan in Captain America, and then just let the acting take over from there. As he gets tempted with more power and influence, you can see it change in his face and his mannerisms to when he actually becomes the Antichrist, well then he goes full-blown evil, and he can do that very effectively, like we saw in The Shift. But even though that was my biggest disappointment with the movie, it's still not my biggest issue with the movie, and that is the narration. I've saved this for the end because it really does kill this movie for me. It doesn't even make it enjoyable to watch. I probably will never watch this movie again because the narration is so bad. This may very well be the worst narration I've ever seen in any movie. I know the original cut of Blade Runner had really bad narration, and I've seen it, and yeah, it's pretty bad. This is so much worse because, for one, all the narration that spans the entire movie is done by Charles Andrew Payne, who plays Reverend Bruce Barnes. He becomes an ally with our other main characters to create their little tribulation force, and he narrates over the entire movie scenes that he's not present for, scenes that he has no real way of knowing what's happening and how characters are feeling, because yes, it is that kind of narration that isn't just, oh, this is happening and this is happening, this is exposition, it's filling us in on things that we wouldn't otherwise know. This is the kind of narration that gives away all subtext and subtlety behind an actor's performance. For instance, there's actually a really touching scene between Ray Steele and his daughter Chloe, and they're talking about faith and whether or not mom was right and where she might be if she's dead, if she's raptured. And it's a pretty thought-provoking and interesting scene because you're seeing characters actually go through real emotion. It's actually a pretty well done and well acted scene until the narration comes in and it actually cuts off the dialogue that we were listening to. Now we just have Pastor Barnes say, oh, Chloe feels really sad about how her mom left, and now she's questioning whether or not it was actually true. And it feels like every subtle, quiet pause or break or just showing a character thinking and processing by themselves, the narration just comes in and spells everything out for you. You know exactly what that character's thinking, you know exactly how they're processing it, and there is nothing left to the imagination. It really does feel like Kevin Sorbo or maybe one of the producers didn't think the audience was smart enough to read into the emotions to understand what they're going through, so they felt they had to put this in as like an afterthought. But come on, guys, these people just lost their family, millions just disappeared, they're going through the tribulation. We can figure out what's going on without overbearing narration. On top of that, the narration isn't even recorded well, because it just sounds like a dude talking straight into a microphone. There's no EQing, there's no treatment of the audio of any kind. It's just straight baseline recording audio. And the last thing I have to say about the narration is that Charles Andrew Payne, who plays Reverend Barnes, just doesn't have a voice fit for voiceover. And I know that's very subjective and it's hard to really quantify what a good voiceover voice is, but you kind of know it when you hear it. And Charles Andrew Payne's voice is fine when he's on camera and when he's acting and there's a lot of emotion behind it, and he seems to do a good job in this role in general, but it just doesn't translate into voiceover. It just really grated on my ears after a while. And that's about it for Left Behind: Rise of the Antichrist, and really that's about it for all of the Left Behind movies, because I really doubt that they're gonna make another one anytime soon after this one. And it really does make me sad to dump on this movie as much as I have been, because there is so much potential in this type of movie. These Rapture movies, whether it's Left Behind series or the Tribulation series or other adaptations of the Rapture that Christian media has produced that I can't remember off the top of my head, all of them I still watch and do get something out of, even when they are bad, because I do have a soft spot for these types of movies, these Rapture end times movies. I love Revelation prophecy. I think it's so fascinating to see the connections between the ever-evolving world that we live in with what the Bible predicts to be the end times. I just think it's so interesting, and there is a million different ways you can interpret that into a movie or into a book or into a TV show. And I find that even the worst of these types of movies usually has one or two ideas that are interesting and thought-provoking and does make me think differently about what my preconceived ideas of the rapture and end times would be. And I can say with all the movies I've reviewed this month, all the Left Behind movies, except possibly the Nicolas Cage movie, they've all presented ideas about the end times that do make you think a little differently about the world that we live in and the Antichrist coming to power in the not too distant future, whenever that may be. But now I'll turn it over to you guys. I'm not going to ask you what you think about this particular Left Behind movie, but I will ask you, what is your favorite Left Behind or end times related movie? Whatever you think, let me know in the comments. And if you like this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe for more content and hit the notification bell to be notified every time I upload a video. As always, I'm Colby. This is my nerdy talk, and I'll see you in the next video.